Liz?
Hi, my name is Liz Sander. I'm a data scientist in the research and development team at Citus Analytics, and today I'm going to talk about how you can lower the stakes of failure using premortems and postmortems. So failure is really scary, but what does it actually look like? So that depends on what you do. I think when you think about postmortems, a lot of times you think about site reliability engineering, and in that case, failure means system downtime or your website's down. But there's a lot of other kinds of failures that we deal with as developers, as data scientists. So it might look like a security vulnerability, or you're shipping code with a critical bug. If you're a data scientist, maybe you built a model that is wrong for some subset of your data, or it's unfair in some way. Maybe you do consulting work, and then failure looks more like going over time or over budget. And for any of us, missing a critical deadline can be a really important kind of failure that we want to try to avoid. And why is failure so scary? Well, so there's the obvious reasons, right? When there are failures, it can cost the company time to resolve the issue. It costs money. But I think there's also this big emotional component. So no one wants to be the person that causes a problem, right? You feel like you've let your team down or your clients down. You don't want to create problems for people, and you really feel responsible. But I'm here to reassure you that failure isn't about you, or at least it's not just about you. We all make mistakes, and they happen within a context. So there are issues that can come up because of the context of your team. So if you're under a lot of time pressure, that can affect the likelihood of making a mistake. Depending on the kind of incentives and norms in your team, that affects what parts of your work that you focus on versus others. Does your team have enough training to work on the issues that you're doing? Is there enough expertise? And then there are also process issues. So are you testing? Is the testing automated, or does it rely on someone going through a series of manual steps correctly? Is the code well documented? Is the release process documented? Are you doing any kind of time or issue tracking? And are you checking on that to make sure that you're staying on track? And then is there anyone else who's looking at code before it's getting shipped out? Do you have some kind of code review? Or if you're a data scientist, is there someone reviewing your methodology? So the key idea here is that we're all human. Individuals are just going to make mistakes, and we can't make that go away. So we need to think as teams to establish systems that can catch and address mistakes when they inevitably happen. And blameless postmortems are really helpful here because they lower the emotional stakes of failing, and it lets us turn failure into an opportunity to learn and grow as a team. So what is a postmortem? It's essentially a process for documenting incidents or failures to identify the root causes, and then determining action items that you can take that'll help prevent or mitigate these failures in the future. Like I said, these are usually talked about in an SRE context, but postmortems aren't just for SREs. I've used them as a data scientist, and they're really helpful, and it's a very general process. So the basic process is just a meeting where you talk about an incident. And the deliverable from that meeting is a document that goes through the incident and action items that you can follow up on. So I mentioned blameless postmortem, and this is important because it can be really difficult to talk about failure or to bring up an incident that happened. And so we need to create a place where people can bring these up and know that they're not going to just have fingers pointed at them. So establishing a blameless postmortem lets the focus be on understanding and improving as a team rather than assigning blame to an individual. And so the key idea here is accountability, but not responsibility falling on any one person. So when I first learned about this, my thought was, okay, but like, what if one person is really responsible, right? And, you know, this really isn't true the vast majority of the time. And the idea behind a blameless postmortem is that everyone involved had good intentions and did the right thing with the information they had. And the vast majority of the time, this really is true. So if you feel like you were responsible for an incident, it's really good to reflect on how you can improve and what you can think about to improve personally, but that's really more of a personal development issue, and that's not what you want to focus on in a postmortem. And then similarly, if you see that someone on your team has consistent performance issues, that is something that you want to address. But that's really kind of something that the manager needs to address, and it's not what you want to focus on in a postmortem. You really want to get at those team processes and systems. So just to contextualize this, I'm going to talk about my own first postmortem. So I was fairly new to Civis, and my manager was out on vacation, and I was doing what seemed like a pretty routine release of a package that I help maintain. It's essentially a wrapper around scikit-learn that handles the DevOps side of training and scoring a model in the cloud. And so I just fixed a couple of bugs, and there was a tiny little change in the dependencies. So I was like, okay, it's fine. It passed all the unit tests. So I did the release, but there was a bug hidden in the Docker image, and I didn't test it against the production environment. And so everyone's models broke. It just completely broke everything. And I spent about a day trying to resolve it before eventually I resolved the issue by releasing a new version of the package that just reverted back the change. So my manager came back, and I was really nervous about it, and I told him what happened, and he said, that's okay, we'll have a postmortem. So what did that look like? So first, to set up a postmortem, you want to invite the people who were directly involved. So in this case, that was me and a co-maintainer who helped me resolve the issue, and a facilitator, who in this case was my manager because he also helps maintain the package. If it's a major incident, you maybe want to include stakeholders for other people who are affected. So in this case, it only affected internal users, but if our external clients had been affected, we might want to bring in someone from client success or a product manager. But in this case, we kept the scope pretty small. So then before you actually meet in person, you can take a postmortem document and fill in some basic information. So that includes the incident period, when did the problem actually start, what triggered it, and when was it resolved. What's the current status? So hopefully it's resolved by the time you're having the postmortem, but if there's any ongoing issues, you want to bring them up there. What's a basic summary? How did it impact users? What was the specific event that triggered it? So in this case, it was me releasing a buggy version. How was it detected? Which in this case, fortunately, was me running our post-release integration tests. How was it resolved? And so this is any actions that you took to try to resolve it, including ones that didn't work. And what are any action items that you can think of upfront? Then during the postmortem itself, you want to have a facilitator. This is important for the blameless aspect of it. You want a person who probably wasn't the most directly involved, but who can help kind of moderate it and make sure that you're keeping it productive rather than focusing on finger pointing. And you want to start by establishing the basic facts by reading through a timeline. So this is what my timeline looked like. And this is, if you're working on something like site reliability, maybe you need to have things down to the minute or second, but in this case, I just have kind of approximate hours. So I tagged the release and discovered the bug. I spent a couple hours working with IT trying to revert the Docker images. This didn't work. And then eventually brought in a co-maintainer to help me debug. And finally, in the evening, we tagged a release that resolved the issue. So once you have those basic facts, you want to agree on what triggered the issue. So in this case, the release, what was the impact, and what were the root causes. So the root causes are trying to get at what are those underlying systems that resulted in the problem. And in this case, we didn't have a specific testing environment that automatically match the production environment. And this means that like problems in our code that were resulting from mismatches with dependencies wouldn't be caught until we actually did a release. Then you can take a chance to reflect on what went well. This is something you want to think about because maybe there are parts of your process that you know you want to keep or replicate elsewhere in the company. In this case, we caught the issue immediately because I did integration tests right after the release. Then what went badly? So what are the areas that really need attention? And in this case, that was the testing environment. Then you also want to think about where you got lucky. And this seems like kind of a strange question at first, but the idea is that you want to identify areas that didn't break but could have. Postmortems are a good way to find issues that need attention, even if they didn't actually go wrong. So in this case, this happened to only be an internal release, but it very easily could have affected external clients. So then, based on those things, you can agree on what actions you need to take and assign them owners. And assigning owners is really important so that the action items actually get done and someone's accountable for them. In this case, we mostly updated our release checklist. So we added instructions for running tests in an environment that exactly matched the production environment. And we also added an instruction not to make a release without 2 maintainers available. This was another area where we got lucky. There happened to be another person who could help me out. But it would have been a lot more difficult to resolve this if that wasn't the case. And then you can think about lessons learned that are maybe not specific actions to take, but things to keep in mind for the future. So obviously testing in the production environment before releasing is important. But also, we decided that in the future we would triage critically buggy releases by immediately cutting a release that fixed it, even if that meant that we had kind of a weird sort of release history where we're just reverting something that we just released. So then what happens next? Of course, you want to follow up on your action items, but it's also important to share what you learned with the rest of the company. And some companies actually release these to external people as well. But at the very least, you want to keep these postmortems together so that people can refer to them in the future and learn from them. And I've gone back and referred to postmortems that I've done and have learned a lot from them, looking back on them. And the idea here is that the action items you come up with today might be the things that went well in the future. And this did actually happen for me. We had another issue with a release, and because of that lesson learned of how we triage critically buggy releases, we fixed the issue immediately, like resolving the bug and then taking the time to actually figure out what the underlying cause was later. So postmortems are a really good way to iteratively improve and learn from past failures. But if you're starting a new project, don't you want to avoid making these mistakes in the first place? So maybe you want to postmortem a project before it fails. And that's where premortems come in. So just to ground this in a specific example, in my first premortem, I was on a new cross-functional team that was going to be building a Flask app to explore audiences, so essentially like subsets of a customer base. And this was a big project with a lot of moving parts. So again, the cross-functional team was new. We had data scientists, engineers, product and design all working together. We had data that was sort of ground truth data, but we were also augmenting it with models, and we needed to store all of that somewhere. And then we had multiple clients who were interested in this product, and we needed to address the range of client needs. And on top of that, there were really hard deadlines and a lot of uncertainty about the project. So naturally, there was a lot of anxiety within the team, and my coworker said, let's meet and talk about it. Let's have a premortem. So similar to a postmortem, you want to have a facilitator who can help keep things running smoothly and keep it on track. But maybe unlike a postmortem, you want to get as broad a number of stakeholders as possible. You want to really go across departments and get anyone who is affected by the project. So in this case, we had engineers, data scientists, and product who would all be working directly on the project, but also sales who were going to be responsible for selling the tool, and client success that was managing our client relationships. So once you have that, you're ready to have your premortem meeting. And the core idea of a premortem is answering this question. Let's imagine that we finished the project and it's failed. What happened? So first you want to spend some time brainstorming why exactly your project could have failed. And this is why it's really important to have a range of people across all of the departments that have a stake in the product. So the engineers were thinking of things that weren't really on my radar, like the application itself is too slow and users don't like it, or there's a security breach. I and other data scientists were thinking about things like ETL problems, or maybe our models are bad, and so our users can't actually trust the output. And then our sales and client-facing people were thinking about things like no one wants to buy it, or maybe it's a little bit too complicated and people don't understand it. So then you should see some themes coming up from all of these different ideas. So you want to try to categorize it into maybe 5 or so different categories. So for us, some of the major categories were app performance, security issues, timeline slip, major feature gaps, or people not using it for one reason or another. Then you want to estimate how important are these things. And there's 2 aspects to the importance. So first you want to vote on how likely is this to happen. So everyone gets a vote from 1 to 3 based on how likely they think it is. So for example, we didn't think that a security issue was very likely because it was something that we had already thought a lot about and were planning around. But we knew that there was a hard deadline that was pretty aggressive, and so we thought that a timeline slip was pretty likely. Then you do the same thing, but for impact. So if this does happen, how bad is it? So even though security, we didn't think it was very likely, if there's some kind of data breach, that's obviously a huge impact that has a big problem for the company. So we said that was very likely. But on the other hand, a timeline slip is maybe something that's more manageable. Then you multiply those 2 numbers together to get your overall importance. And you can talk about them from most important to least important as you have time. So in this case, we thought that a feature gap is actually the most important aspect, or that we would build something that people ended up not using. And when you're discussing it, you want to think about what could we have done to avoid or mitigate a failure in this area. And so this highlighted issues for us, like making sure that we're directly communicating with clients as we're building this to make sure that the features are the things that they're expecting and the things that they need. And also continuing to do user interviews with other potential clients to make sure that this is a tool that will be used outside of our initial clients. So then after the meeting, you want the facilitator or someone else to organize the notes and send them out. And then you want to check in on your risks and your action items regularly. So if you use some kind of agile framework for development, maybe during a sprint retrospective, you can take a look at these and make sure you're still on track. So you can use these notes in retros, and then if you have any postmortems, that's a good place to look at these notes too. So why bother going through this whole kind of artificial exercise? So again, it kind of comes down to lowering the stakes of failure, or about talking about failure in particular. Team members can be really reluctant to bring up their concerns, even if they think there are major issues with the project. And this is because they don't want to be seen as being negative or causing problems or like contradicting the management's priorities. And so what you want to do is create a space where those concerns are actually an asset, right? The goal of the meeting is to talk about failures, and you are being a good team member by bringing them up. It also reveals issues that are kind of domain specific so that the whole team is aware of them. The things the data scientists were thinking about was really different than what the salespeople were thinking about. But by bringing us all into a room, which maybe doesn't happen so often, it's a place where everyone can make their concerns known so that everyone is aware of it. And the data scientists and engineers can be thinking about these more user-focused issues as we're building the tool. And this is why it's really important to bring in both technical and non-technical stakeholders. It's also good for getting people to reflect on the project and the processes before something fails, right? Maybe you can catch things before it actually happens. And by giving everyone a chance to speak out about their concerns, it helps get people on board because they feel like they're listened to, and maybe they get additional information and context that helps them not be so concerned. So just a couple of closing thoughts. Failure is going to happen, but we can only really learn from it by bringing it out into the open. And to do that, we need to create spaces that lower the emotional stakes, where it's acceptable to talk about failure and where it's encouraged. And pre-mortems and post-mortems are both great opportunities for this, and it lets you think about failures both before a project and after an incident. And again, the really important thing here is focusing on systems and processes, which are things that you have more control over as a team, and are things that make people feel more comfortable and can collaboratively improve together, and not focus on blaming specific individuals. And so with that, I just want to leave you with a few links. You don't have to worry about taking pictures of these. The slides are all on my website. But Google has a site reliability engineering book that's really helpful, even if you're not an SRE. It's available for free online at that link. The chapter on postmortem culture is really helpful. And there's also just a few articles here on different processes for premortems and postmortems. And there's just lots of variations of these processes, so it's useful to read a couple of different ones and think, what is a good fit for your team? What does your team really need to get out of it? And you can adapt it to be something that works for you. So thank you.
So there's been a lot of failures, high-profile failures in the news.
Mm-hmm.
Is there any postmortem that you recommend reading to help your team improve how they do things?
Do you mean a specific postmortem process?
Yeah.
Or?
Yeah.
So Civis does our postmortems based on Google's postmortem process, and I think that's a really good place to start. So depending on how, that really is designed around the site reliability engineering case. So if you're doing something that's more around model quality or consulting engagement, maybe some pieces of that are more or less relevant. So I think that's a great place to start, and then you can adapt it from there.
Cool. Thank you.
Yeah. Any other questions? Okay.
Could you make a model based on your pre-mortems to predict the mechanistic failure?
So the question is, can you make a model based on the results of your pre-mortems to predict your post-mortems? I like that idea. I feel like you might need a lot of data, so maybe if you have enough projects and failures, I guess. Yeah. Yeah, that's a great question. I think I actually made a slide about that. Yeah, so this is one of those things that you really do need buy-in from management for, because it's very much like a culture thing. If management has a blameful culture, it's going to be hard to create that kind of open environment. So talking to your team and getting support, if you don't think your manager is going to support it from the beginning, getting some support from your team and bringing it up together is a good approach. But I think fundamentally you do really need to get buy-in from leads to make this work. So I don't know, maybe you can give them a copy of the SRE book as a present or something. Yeah. Yeah, go.
From a practical implementation point of view, how do you decide what constitutes a failure, and then who's responsible for bringing this up and deciding to do a postmortem?
Yeah, that's a good question. So anyone can say hey, I think it would be helpful to do a postmortem on this. I think it's something that a lead should be especially aware of, and because that really helps create that culture of making people feel okay about bringing it up. As for what constitutes a failure, yeah, that does kind of vary from team to team. But I think it does need to reach some threshold of causing issues for it to be, essentially it's is it worth it to have this hour-long meeting where we talk through it? And that sort of depends on the impact of it and is going to vary from team to team. Orange shirt in the back. The question is, on average, how long do postmortems take? So the way that I've done them in the past, it's about an hour is like the time block that you want to set aside. And we usually do use up most of that because a lot of issues about processes, and there's a lot of like brainstorming about how to improve processes based on it. And then there's like a little bit of additional time around just getting stakeholders to come to the meeting and looking through the document ahead of time. So maybe an extra like 15 minutes to a half hour to fill out the document ahead of time. Yeah.
Question about your pre-mortem
Mm-hmm.
process. What were some of the challenges or surprises you ran into early on, and how did you modify or evolve your pre-mortem process?
What were challenges I ran into in the pre-mortem or in the project itself?
The pre-mortem process.
Yeah, so one thing was just figuring out how to allocate time. So because it was pretty new to the company overall, we were kind of just figuring it out as we went along. So yeah, I think like keeping the brainstorming piece, you want to like have enough time where people are coming up with ideas, but it's easy for that to kind of extend over a lot of time, and it takes more time than you might expect to do that categorization, and then both like voting on how important things are and then talking through the different things. So I think it's something that could potentially benefit from being split either into 2 meetings or having the meeting be like, we did an hour and it was like pretty tight, so it could definitely extend longer than that. So I think the time management's really the biggest part because there's a lot of pieces to it. Yeah, and the other thing is, for that project, we didn't incorporate the premortem notes into our sprint retros, and I think that's something that I would definitely do in the future, because I think you get a lot more benefit out of it that way.
Thank you.
Thanks.